Scientists ran a DNA test on a 7,000-year-old skeleton found in a Spanish cave, and what they discovered broke everything we thought we knew about blue eyes. This man had dark skin, dark hair, and bright blue eyes. Historical records from ancient Egypt, Rome, and the Viking world all described blue-eyed people as touched by gods or cursed by demons. So where did blue eyes actually come from? Every blue-eyed person alive today shares one single ancestor, one person, one moment in history. Based entirely on real historical documents and archaeological evidence, this is the story they never taught you. For 200,000 years, every human being on this planet had brown eyes. Not mostly, not almost all, every single one. The hunter crouching in the tall grass of the African savanna, the woman grinding ochre into red paint on a flat stone, the elder watching the stars from a ridge above the valley. All of them, brown eyes without a single exception for the entire length of human history up to that point. This wasn't random. This was engineering. The human body produces a pigment called melanin. It acts as a shield, absorbing ultraviolet radiation from the sun before it can destroy the cells underneath. Near the equator, where our ancestors first evolved, the sun is direct and relentless. High melanin in the skin, the hair, and the iris wasn't a choice. It was survival. Brown eyes weren't beautiful or ugly. They were armor. And for hundreds of thousands of years, no human being needed anything else. Then, around 70,000 years ago, small groups of people began walking out of Africa, slowly, in waves, crossing into territories no human had ever touched, through the Arabian Peninsula, into the Middle East, pushing further north and east into Europe and Central Asia. They were following animals, following rivers, following whatever instinct drives a species to keep moving beyond the horizon. And the further north they traveled, the more everything changed. In northern latitudes, the sun sits low. In winter, it barely rises. The same melanin that protected your skin near the equator now blocked the faint northern sunlight your body needed to produce vitamin D. Without vitamin D, bones weaken, immune systems fail, reproduction becomes harder. So over thousands of years, the populations moving north began to change. Skin lightened, hair lightened. The body was slowly dialing down melanin to survive a world with far less sun. But the eyes held on to brown far longer than anyone expected. Here's what the archaeological record tells us about these early European inhabitants. And this is the part that turns everything upside down. The people living in Europe 8,000 years ago. The hunter-gatherers who buried their dead in shallow caves, who painted animals on rock faces, who tracked elk through frozen pine forests. Many of them did not look like modern Europeans. At all. They had dark skin, dark features, a face that would look more familiar in sub-Saharan Africa than in Scandinavia. Europe was a dark-skinned continent for most of its inhabited history. These people lived in small bands of 20 to 50 individuals, no farms, no permanent villages. They followed the herds through the seasons. Deer in summer, moving to lower ground in winter. They dried meat over fires. They knew which roots were edible after the first frost. They navigated hundreds of kilometers of wilderness by memory, by star patterns, by the behavior of rivers. Their tools were elegant. Flint blades worked to a razor edge. Bone needles fine enough to stitch leather clothing against the cold. They were not struggling primitives. They were masters of a world that no longer exists. And among them, at some point, in some camp in some part of this ancient Europe, a child was born with something no human being had ever had before. There is a place called La Braña. It's a cave in the mountains of northwestern Spain. A quiet place today, green hills, cold streams, the kind of landscape that looks like it has been there forever. And in 2006, archaeologists digging into the cave floor found bones. 2 individuals, buried approximately 7,000 years ago. They extracted DNA from the teeth. What came back from the laboratory stopped people cold. This man, La Braña 1, as scientists named him, had dark skin. The genetic markers were unambiguous. His pigmentation was closer to a modern sub-Saharan African than to any modern European. His hair was dark. His features were what you'd expect from the ancient hunter-gatherer populations that inhabited Mesolithic Europe. But his eyes were blue. That combination, dark skin, blue eyes, seems almost impossible to us because we've spent centuries associating blue eyes exclusively with pale Northern European features. But genetics doesn't care about our assumptions. The mutation for blue eyes had arrived. The mutations for lighter skin had not yet spread to his population. Labrana I walked through a Spanish forest 7,000 years ago, hunting deer along riverbanks, sleeping under pine branches in winter, with eyes the color of a winter sky in a face we would not recognize as European. His daily life, based on archaeological evidence at the site, was one of extraordinary physical competence and constant movement. Animal bones found nearby showed processed deer, wild boar, and freshwater fish. His teeth showed the wear patterns of someone who used his mouth as a third hand, gripping and pulling leather, preparing sinew, carrying things in his teeth the way his hands were busy. Isotope analysis of his bones told researchers he spent his life moving across a large geographic range, never staying in one place for long. He had no pottery, no groundstone tools for processing grain, no domestic animals except possibly a dog. What he had was intimate knowledge of a landscape, passed down through generations, refined over thousands of years of living in that specific ecosystem. And somewhere in his ancestry, or perhaps in his own body, in the moment of his own conception, a tiny alteration had occurred in a gene called HER2. A switch flipped. Melanin production in the iris suppressed. Here is the extraordinary part. The DNA test results on Labrana I aren't just about one man. The specific genetic variant that caused his blue eyes is identical to the variant found in every blue-eyed person alive on Earth today. Scientists have tested this across thousands of individuals. The variant doesn't appear in multiple versions. It's not a family of related mutations. It's one, single, change. Every blue-eyed person in Norway, Australia, Canada, the United States, every one of them carries the same genetic signature that Labrana I carried in that cave in Spain. He may not be the original source, but he's the clearest early evidence we have of a world that was about to change forever. By the time written history begins, roughly 5,000 years ago, blue eyes had already spread far enough across human populations to attract serious attention, and that attention was almost never neutral. Let's go to ancient Egypt first. The Egyptians were obsessed with the color blue, not because it was common, because it was rare. Blue pigment, real, deep, resonant blue, was extraordinarily difficult to produce in the ancient world. The Egyptians invented their own, Egyptian blue, a copper silicate compound that required temperatures over 900 degrees Celsius to synthesize. They used it to paint the eyes of gods, the collars of pharaohs, the walls of the most sacred temples. Lapis lazuli, a stone mined almost exclusively in northeastern Afghanistan, traded across thousands of kilometers of ancient trade routes, was ground into powder to paint the eyebrows and eyelids of divine statues. The funeral mask of Tutankhamun is inlaid with lapis lazuli around the eyes. To give a deity blue eyes was to connect that deity to the sky, to the primordial waters of creation, to the realm beyond human reach. When actual humans appeared with blue eyes, which happened as trade routes brought genetic mixing across the Mediterranean world, the reaction was electric. Here was a person who carried in their own body the color of the divine. But across the Mediterranean, that same power cut both ways. The concept of the evil eye, one of the oldest documented supernatural beliefs in human history, appeared independently in ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, Persia, and the Arab world. The fear was this: certain individuals possessed a gaze so charged that merely looking at something, a healthy child, a newborn lamb, a ripening crop, could curse it, and unusual eyes were considered the most dangerous of all. Roman writers documented this fear with complete seriousness. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, who died observing the eruption of Vesuvius, whose writings survived for nearly 2,000 years, wrote about tribes whose members could kill animals with a glance. He named specific ethnic groups believed to carry this power, particularly people from regions along the Black Sea coast and the Balkans. The Greek philosopher Plutarch wrote an entire essay attempting to explain the mechanism of the evil eye. He proposed, with scholarly gravity, that the human eye emits invisible particles that can transmit influence across distance. He was trying to be scientific. The fear was that real. The protective amulet, the blue glass bead, the nazar, appeared across Turkey, Greece, the Levant and Persia. Its logic was direct: fight the eye with an eye. The blue bead stares back at the dangerous gaze, absorbing or redirecting its power. Today, nazar beads hang from the rear-view mirrors of cars in Istanbul, from doorways in Athens, from baby cribs in New Jersey. That small piece of blue glass encodes 3,000 years of documented fear. In the Norse world, the symbolism ran in a different direction, but the intensity was the same. Odin, the Allfather, the god of war and wisdom and death, was described in the sagas as possessing eyes of unnerving power. He famously traded one eye for cosmic wisdom. His remaining eye saw further and deeper than any mortal gaze. The Norse associated blue eyes with the capacity for sight beyond the visible, with prophecy, with the ability to perceive what was hidden. Warriors with striking blue eyes were said to carry Odin's favor. Certain skalds, the Norse poets who functioned as historians, mythologists, and journalists simultaneously, described notable individuals, specifically by their eye color, as a shorthand for their character and fate. Blue eyes across the ancient world meant you were marked. Whether by gods or by danger depended entirely on who was reading the signs. In the Tarim Basin, a vast desert depression in what is now the Xinjiang region of Western China, archaeologists beginning in the late 19th century discovered something that immediately became a source of fierce academic and political controversy. Mummies, not Egyptian-style mummies, not artificially preserved bodies wrapped in linen. These were naturally mummified by the extreme aridity of the desert, preserved for over 3,000 years with astonishing completeness. Skin intact, hair intact, clothing intact, and the clothing was wool, plaid wool, woven in patterns that looked, to every Western archaeologist who examined them, startlingly similar to Celtic textile traditions from the other side of the Eurasian continent. The hair of these mummies was not East Asian, it was light brown, reddish, blonde. Some of them, based on preserved eye socket tissue and the structure of the iris, appeared to have had light-colored eyes. They were buried in a desert in Western China, but they looked European. The tallest of these mummies, a man discovered near the oasis town of Chershan, now called Chershan, stood approximately 6 feet tall. He was buried with 10 hats in different styles, suggesting either extraordinary wealth or a life of extensive travel across multiple cultures. He wore a red tunic and tartan-patterned leg wrappings. The sophistication of the weaving was remarkable for 3,000 years ago. His face, preserved by the desert, showed high cheekbones, a prominent nose, and features that multiple physical anthropologists described as Caucasian, meaning, in the strict archaeological sense, originating from populations west of the Eurasian steppe. Who were these people? What were they doing in the Tarim Basin? The current consensus, based on DNA analysis finally permitted by Chinese authorities, after decades of political sensitivity around the finds, is that the earliest Tarim mummies descended from a population called the Ancient North Eurasians, a group genetically distinct from both East Asians and Western Europeans, whose ancestry is also found in the early steppe populations that spread Indo-European languages across Eurasia. They weren't Vikings who wandered off course. They weren't lost Celts. They were something older, representatives of a Bronze Age population that existed before the modern divisions of East and West became fixed. But their presence in the Tarim Basin tells us something important. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route for goods. It was a corridor for people, for genes, for eye color, for the physical variation that today we imagine as neatly confined to continents and ethnic categories. Blue eyes didn't stay in Europe. They traveled, Around 1,000 years ago, the steppe grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea were home to a people archaeologists call the Yamnaya. They were cattle herders, mobile, organized around clans and raiding parties. They had wagons, among the earliest documented use of wheeled transport in human history. They had horses, which they may have been among the first to ride rather than simply eat. They were, by all archaeological indications, extremely good at violence. Beginning around 3000 BCE, they started moving west into Europe and east into Central Asia. Within roughly 500 years, genetic traces of this population had flooded across the European continent. In some regions, they replaced up to 75% of the existing population. The hunter-gatherers who descended from people like Labrania I, the early farmers who had arrived from Anatolia. Both groups were largely absorbed into a new genetic reality shaped by steppe expansion. The Yamnaya and related steppe groups carried the blue eye variant with them into populations that had never encountered it before. 2,000 years later, the Norse continued this dispersal on a scale that still astonishes historians. Between 793 CE, when Norse raiders struck the monastery at Lindisfarne off the English coast, and 1066 CE, when the Norman descendants of Norse settlers conquered England at Hastings, Scandinavian peoples touched almost every corner of the known world. Their ships, the famous longboats, designed to navigate both open ocean and shallow rivers, carried them to Iceland, which they settled permanently, to Greenland, to the coast of North America, which they called Vinland, and where archaeological evidence confirms their presence at L'Anse-aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. 500 years before Columbus, they established the Duchy of Normandy in what is now France. They founded the city of Dublin in Ireland. They settled the Orkney and Shetland Islands, the Scottish coast, parts of northeastern England. Norse warriors called Varangians travelled the river systems of Eastern Europe, the Dnieper, the Volga, all the way to Constantinople, where they served as elite personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors. Icelandic sagas recorded their travels in meticulous detail. Arab merchants who traded with Norse traders along the Volga wrote accounts of them, detailed, curious, sometimes horrified descriptions of their customs, their clothing, their burial practices. The Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, writing in 921 CE, described Norse traders he encountered near the Volga River with a mix of fascination and disgust. His account is one of the most vivid records of Norse daily life from an outside perspective. Wherever these populations travelled and settled, they left genetic descendants. And with those descendants went the blue eye variant into gene pools across Ireland, England, France, Russia, and beyond. The blue-eyed gene didn't spread because anyone planned it. It spread because people moved, people fought, people traded, people fell in love across cultural boundaries, had children, and kept moving. In 1665, a Dutch painter named Johannes Vermeer completed a small canvas that has been staring back at the world ever since. Girl with a pearl earring. She occupies a dark background, turned slightly, looking back over her shoulder. The painting has no documented subject, no name, no historical record of who sat for it. For 350 years she has remained anonymous. What everyone notices are her eyes. They are blue-grey, luminous, catching a light that seems to come from somewhere beyond the canvas. There is something in the directness of her gaze, an intelligence, a question, a dare, that has generated more written commentary than almost any other portrait in Western art history. Tracy Chevalier wrote a novel imagining her life. The novel became a film. Scholars have proposed she was Vermeer's daughter, his maid, his patron's daughter. No one knows. The historical record is silent. But art historians studying the painting with modern imaging technology discovered something unexpected. Beneath the visible surface, Vermeer painted over an earlier version of the background. He also, according to pigment analysis, used ground lapis lazuli for elements of the image, the same precious stone that ancient Egyptians used to represent divine sight. Whether that's coincidence or intention, no one can say. Now consider a very different historical figure, Genghis Khan. the founder of the largest land empire in human history, a man who conquered from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Eastern Europe, whose descendants ruled from Beijing to Baghdad. Genghis Khan left almost no verified physical descriptions from his own lifetime. But Persian chronicles, written within a generation of his death, describe him in terms that have puzzled historians ever since. Tall with a long beard, vigorous in old age, and with green eyes, possibly blue-grey eyes. Eyes that were distinctly unusual for a man of Mongolian heritage. One Persian historian, Rashid al-Din, who compiled a massive history of the Mongols in the early 14th century and had access to sources and informants closer to the Mongol court, described the Khan's appearance in ways consistent with unusual light-colored eyes. Is this accurate? Was Genghis Khan carrying the genetic legacy of the ancient steppe populations, the Yamnaya, the Bronze Age nomads who had moved blue-eye genes across Eurasia for thousands of years before the Mongol Empire existed? The genetics is plausible. The steppe populations of Central Asia had been mixing for millennia. Light eyes in Mongolian lineages, while uncommon, were documented. DNA analysis of remains claimed to be from Genghis Khan has not been successfully completed. The location of his burial remains one of history's deliberate mysteries. He reportedly ordered his burial kept secret, and his soldiers killed anyone who witnessed the procession to the grave site. A man who conquered half the known world erased the evidence of his own death. His eyes, if he truly had light eyes, have been looked for ever since. The history of blue eyes takes its darkest turn in the 20th century. In the ideology of the Nazi regime, the racial pseudoscience that underpinned the Holocaust and governed the policies of the Third Reich from 1933 to 1945, blue eyes occupied a central symbolic position. They were declared a marker of what Nazi theorists called the Aryan race, a supposedly superior European racial type, physically characterized by tall stature, fair skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. This ideology had no basis in legitimate genetics, none. The scientists who built it were not serious researchers. They were ideologues constructing biological justifications for political violence. But the consequences of that pseudoscience were catastrophic. Josef Mengele was a physician. He had a doctorate in anthropology and a medical degree. He was, by academic credential, qualified to conduct research. At Auschwitz, where he served as a camp doctor, he conducted experiments on prisoners, particularly twins and people with unusual physical characteristics, in the name of genetic science. His obsession with eye color was documented by survivors and at the Nuremberg trials. Mengele injected chemicals, including methylene blue, directly into the eyes of children, attempting to change their color from brown to blue. The experiments caused severe infections, blindness, and death. He collected the eyes of victims he killed and mailed them to colleagues as research specimens. Survivor testimonies from Auschwitz describe Mengele's particular interest in children with heterochromia, a condition where each eye is a different color, which we'll discuss shortly. He referred to these children as his special subjects. Beyond Auschwitz, the Nazi regime ran a program called Lebensborn, literally Spring of Life. Established in 1935 by SS chief Heinrich Himmler, its stated purpose was to increase the birth rate of children with what they classified as Aryan characteristics: blue eyes, blonde hair, fair skin. The program included maternity homes where unmarried German women with the right physical profile could give birth in secrecy, with the SS arranging adoption of the children into approved families. It also, during the occupation of Norway, Poland, and other countries, involved the abduction of children who appeared to match the physical criteria. Norwegian children were particularly targeted. Norway had one of the highest rates of the blue-eye gene in Europe. Estimates of the number of children taken from occupied Norway ranged from 8,000 to 12,000. Many were never returned to their birth families. The Norwegian children of Nazi-affiliated relationships, the so-called war children, faced severe social stigma after the war. Some were institutionalized, some were sterilized under Norwegian law in the 1940s and 50s. The entire apparatus, the ideology, the experiments, the theft of children, was built on a physical feature with no bearing whatsoever on intelligence, character, or human worth. A feature produced by the suppression of a single gene. A feature that appeared by the genetic record in a man with dark skin in a cave in Spain. The science that the Nazis claimed to be doing was not science. The science that has actually been done in universities in Copenhagen, in genetics labs in Boston and London, in archaeological digs in Spain, tells a completely different story. In the entire recorded history of human medicine, few conditions have attracted more myth, suspicion, and fascination than heterochromia, the condition of having two irises of different colors, one eye brown, one eye blue, or green, or partly blue within a brown iris, a sectoral variation where the pigment shifts partway around the circle, like a sunrise cut off at the horizon. It appears in roughly 1% of the human population. It is almost never medically significant, but historically, it was almost always considered supernatural. The historical record of heterochromia in notable figures is surprisingly long. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who conquered an empire stretching from Greece to northwestern India before dying at 32, was described by ancient sources as having one dark eye and one light eye. The Greek term used was heteroglosson, meaning different colored. His personal historian Arrian, writing in the 2nd century CE, mentions this feature. Ancient coins and the famous Alexander mosaic from Pompeii don't fully resolve the question, but the textual references are consistent enough that historians take them seriously. David Bowie, separated from Alexander 23 centuries, also had what appeared to be heterochromia. His left eye appeared permanently dilated, with a larger, darker pupil than his right. In reality, this was not heterochromia, but anisocoria, unequal pupil size caused by a fight at school when he was 15, which resulted in permanent damage to the muscles controlling his left pupil. The effect made his eyes appear different colors in photographs, and became one of the most iconic elements of his visual identity. The 19th century Russian mystic Grigory Rasputin, whose influence over the Romanov royal family contributed to the political instability that preceded the Russian Revolution, was described by contemporaries as possessing eyes of unnerving power. Accounts vary on the exact color. Some said gray, some light blue, but consistently emphasized their unsettling quality. Rasputin himself encouraged the mystique, using intense eye contact as a deliberate tool in his interactions with the wealthy and powerful. In many indigenous cultures across North America, a horse with one blue eye was considered either cursed or gifted with spiritual vision. The same belief appeared in Mongolia. In Northern Europe, a dog or horse born with one blue eye was sometimes thought to see into both the living world and the world of the dead simultaneously. The Cherokee had a documented tradition of specifically selecting horses with wall eyes, the term for blue or partially blue eyes in animals, for use by medicine people and spiritual leaders, believing those animals possessed enhanced perception. What is the medical reality behind heterochromia in humans? It happens when melanin distribution during development becomes asymmetrical between the two eyes. Sometimes it's genetic. Sometimes it occurs during fetal development due to injury or localized differences in gene expression. Occasionally, it's the result of injury or disease after birth. The condition is entirely harmless, but the history of how humans have interpreted it spans 3,000 years of documented wonder. In 1900, approximately 80% of Americans of European descent had blue eyes. By 2006, that number had dropped to roughly 33%. By the 2020s, the estimate sits somewhere between 17% and 27%, depending on the study methodology and population sampled. The mathematics of genetics explains this without any drama or mystery. Blue eyes are what geneticists call a recessive trait, meaning you need to inherit the blue eye variant from both parents to express it. If you inherit it from only one parent, the brown eye gene from the other parent takes over, and you have brown eyes. but you still carry the blue eye variant. And you can still pass it to your children. Brown eyes are dominant. As populations with predominantly brown eyes, from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, mix with populations that had historically high frequencies of the blue eye variant, the trait doesn't disappear. It recedes, it hides in genetics, skipping generations, waiting for two carriers to have children together. What's actually happening in places like the United States isn't the loss of the gene, it's the dilution of its expression. The variant is still in those gene pools, it's just expressing less often. Immigration patterns drive most of this change. The United States in 1900 drew the vast majority of its immigrant population from Northern and Central Europe, the regions with historically high blue eye frequencies. The immigration patterns of the mid and late 20th century, and particularly after the Immigration Act of 1965, brought far larger numbers of people from Latin America, Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa. The gene pool diversified. The math did the rest. Does this mean blue eyes will eventually disappear from the human species? No, not on any foreseeable timeline. As long as two carriers have children together, blue-eyed children will be born. The variant is too widely distributed, across too many countries, too many gene pools, to ever be eliminated by natural demographic mixing. What might change, over thousands of years, is frequency. The same process that spread blue eyes across Europe in the first place, population movement, mixing, the chaos of human history, is now operating in the other direction. Not through violence or displacement, but through something far more ordinary. People from different parts of the world meeting, living together, building families. Labrania 1's genetic legacy is not disappearing. It's blending, it's becoming part of something larger and more complicated than any single population. In 2008, a study out of the University of Copenhagen analyzed the genetic data of 800 blue-eyed individuals from countries across Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas. The finding was this: every single one of them shared an identical genetic variant in the same location on chromosome 15. Not similar, not related, identical. The researchers concluded that all blue-eyed humans share a single common ancestor. One person, one mutation, one moment. Think about what that means. A blue-eyed person in Norway and a blue-eyed person in Jordan, a blue-eyed person in Australia, and a blue-eyed person in Argentina. They are, through this single genetic marker, more closely related to each other than most of them realize. Connected by a thread of inheritance that runs back 6,000 to 10,000 years to a single individual whose name we will never know. This is what DNA testing, at its most serious, in university research programs, in archaeological genetics labs, in peer-reviewed studies built on thousands of samples, actually reveals about human beings. Not hierarchy, not superiority, not what the Nazi ideologues claim to be doing with their pseudoscience. It reveals connection. The story of blue eyes is, at its core, a story about how human beings moved across the earth, adapted to environments that were trying to kill them, mixed with strangers who became family, and carried their genetic legacy forward through war and trade and migration and ordinary love. Labrania 1, dark-skinned, blue-eyed, hunting deer in a Spanish forest 7,000 years ago, is the ancestor of people who have no idea he exists, people who look nothing like him, people living in cities he could never have imagined. The Tarim mummies, buried in a Chinese desert in plaid wool, their features out of place in every category we've constructed, are evidence that human beings have always refused to stay where we put them on the map. The ancient Egyptians painting lapis lazuli around the eyes of their gods, the Roman writers who feared the glance of strangers, the Norse skalds who said blue eyes meant you had seen what the gods see, all of them were responding to something real, something rare, something that arrived once from one person and then spread across the whole of human civilization. Every blue-eyed person alive today carries, in their DNA, a connection to every other blue-eyed person who has ever lived. We are, all of us, descendants of one moment of change. That is what the historical record tells us. That is what the bones say. That is what the DNA confirms. One ancestor, one world,